Hey guys, welcome back to the Guilty as Charged podcast. I'm so happy to be joined now by friend of the show, Henry Ettinger, who covers the Browns for Blue Wire, fellow Blue Wire podcast. But he's on the show today because he happened to cover Rashawn Slater and the Northwestern Wildcats while he was in college. So very happy to have him on the show. Henry, how you doing today, man?
I'm fantastic, Stephen. Very excited to change things up. I do love my Browns, but also to get to talk some Northwestern football because I've been talking about the Browns for the last couple of years, really pretty much all the time. And although I watch every Northwestern game at this point, I'm pretty much confined to texting my college buddies about it. So very excited to actually get back into the swing of things and talk about them again.
There we go. So we will talk about the Browns really quickly. And if you guys are interested in the Browns, make sure you check him out at the Rebuild, again, found on Blue Wire. You can follow him at Henry_Ettinger as well. So Henry, I think the Browns, they've been regarded very highly this offseason. The Chargers have as well. But what kind of ceiling are the Browns looking at after this past weekend?
Well, I think the Browns' ceiling is still ultimately, ride or dies with Baker Mayfield. And I think, look, I think they have a Super Bowl roster. I thought that before the draft, but the draft also fell in their favor. They also added a Northwestern guy in Greg Newsome, addressing their biggest need at outside corner for sure. And then Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah fell to them in the second round. It sounds like because of some heart issues. But, if he is on the field, he's a Swiss Army knife as far as a linebacker safety hybrid that a bunch of people had, as one of the top 15, 20 players on their board. So, you throw those two guys into the mix, a speedster and Anthony Schwartz in the third round to complement Odell Beckham and Jarvis Landry, and you're off to the races. I mean, this team was really held back by its defense last year more than its offense. And they are looking at 8 or 9 new starters between the draft and free agency. Basically, everybody outside of Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward has some competition, at least at their position.
Well, we kind of joked about, on our show before the season started or before the off season started, like, oh, like the Chargers could look to the Browns as kind of like their model of how to build around their young quarterback. Go get him an analytically driven head coach who will be able to, upgrade the scheme, upgrade the offensive line, get him some more weapons. And they've kind of done that. So I have to admit, it is a little weird living in a world where you look at the Browns as one of the top teams in the AFC. And, frankly, I'm sick of watching the Chiefs win in December and January all the time. So if the Browns can do it, I think Chargers fans would be happy with that outcome.
I certainly hope so. They've got a small window here before they're likely going to have to give Baker an extension, and that might deplete this roster a little bit. But they've certainly given him all the tools, and I'm a Baker fan. I think last year in particular he made some great strides forward, but it's not going to be the roster's problem at all. They've surrounded him with a fantastic offensive line, which has been huge to his development. And we'll certainly talk about that with the Chargers, because I think that's one thing that they're getting really right here. And so now, as the NFL so often goes, it sits in your quarterback's hands, but it's certainly exciting times in Cleveland.
It is exciting times in Cleveland and exciting times in Los Angeles as well. Obviously you've been able to cover Rashawn Slater, and we're going to dive into him. I personally never thought that the Chargers had a chance to get him at 13. I figured that he would go in the top 10, and then obviously, the teams, ahead of them decided to go with the cornerbacks. The Giants traded out, which definitely helped them. What was your reaction to the Chargers, getting Rashawn Slater to fall in their laps?
It was a great pick, I think, for them, and you brought it up. Tackles that are franchise cornerstone left tackle type players aren't available at 13 typically. Four tackles went in the top 13 picks last year. And depending on who you ask, Rashawn Slater was the number 1 tackle on some boards, and certainly top 2, I think, pretty widely as far as the draft experts go. So you just don't see that guy at 13, but you mentioned it. There were some other teams, the Panthers, the Broncos, that went on the defensive side of the football. And of course, the quarterbacks played a huge piece in that as well, with the Bears trading up. But to get a player like Slater at 13 for the Chargers is massive. I mean, you obviously have the quarterback in place here, and you're trying to surround him with the right guys. They were almost too good, this last season,
Right.
where you wouldn't think somebody like that would be available. But for Slater to reach them at 13, I thought was both surprising and very fortunate.
Yeah, just kind of comparing the previous two classes, I felt really, really good about all four offensive tackles last year. I felt like all four of them would be able to be franchise cornerstone players. This year, obviously, really only the two in Penei Sewell and Rashawn Slater. So definitely worked out in the Chargers' favor. I'd like to go back in time a little bit, because Rashawn Slater has kind of talked about his high school didn't win a lot of games. He was kind of under recruited. What do you remember about the recruitment process for Rashawn Slater to Northwestern?
Not highly touted, not a highly touted guy. He was a 3-star prospect, came in very under the radar for the most part. Northwestern, for not being a powerhouse by any means, has had really solid offensive lines under Pat Fitzgerald for
Right.
really the last decade or so. And Slater came in, and I think most people thought was going to be a backup, but there was an open spot available his freshman season at the right tackle position. And when that depth chart came out where Rashawn Slater had won the position battle there, I think a lot of people were surprised. This was not a guy that, people were talking about in the recruiting process as somebody who was going to come in and start day one. He wasn't, one of those 4-star guys that gets Northwestern fans really excited because we never get 5-star guys. And so he really, as you said, was underrated the whole time. I mean, he obviously has an athletic pedigree. He's the son of a former NBA player, but other than that, there really wasn't a whole lot of buzz about the guy. He came from Houston, not really a typical, area for Northwestern to be recruiting. So really, until week one, where he was starting for Northwestern, nobody talked about him. Nobody probably even knew who he was.
Yeah, definitely, as a Utah alumni, I can relate to that whole experience of never getting 5-star recruits. So definitely understand that process. You mentioned that he played at guard, he played at right tackle, he played at left tackle. That's kind of, typically not what you see out of, an NFL offensive lineman who gets drafted in the first round. Typically, you're looking at someone who played maybe a guard for a year, then left tackle exclusively or right tackle exclusively. How did he handle all of the changes that was happening at Northwestern? Because, that kind of movement is really unprecedented.
It is, but I think it's important to remember, as I said, Northwestern has had a good offensive line. And when Rashawn Slater came in, Blake Hance was their starting left tackle. And for those who are not familiar with Blake Hance, he's now actually a reserve guard on the Browns, but an
That's
NFL
funny.
caliber offensive lineman. And so they also had, a really prolific center. They had some good guards. So Slater came in at right tackle because that was the only spot for him. And he was just a really talented player. And as you said, that's not the typical path. He slid into guard as well because of injuries and then ultimately ended up at left tackle his last season. But he was good in every spot. We can talk about his production in more detail, but he was fantastic as a right tackle, graded out basically as the highest freshman offensive lineman in the country there at his mix of tackle and guard. He performed admirably at left tackle. And I think that's part of the reason, he's so attractive to many teams. I think personally that he is a left tackle for sure. I know there are certainly some doubts about that. And there's that idea that he might have to slide into guard. And sure, maybe that's not what the Chargers are looking for, but he was successful at guard too. I mean, he was just all over the place. He handled the schemes well at Northwestern and pretty much dominated wherever they put him.
Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way, because the way that he dominated is really interesting to me, because no shade, but Northwestern was losing a lot his last year, and everybody kind of talks about the Chase Young game and how great he did against Chase Young, and then you look at the scoreboard and it's 52-3. So what do you think that says about his demeanor and his personality, that he's able to continue to take care of his business despite when things around him on the team are not going very well?
Well, he came in a very mature player, I would say, already at Northwestern, and he kept that his entire time. Whether it was a position change, whether it was the team going up and down, he was a constant. And I think that's important, obviously, for an offensive lineman,
Yeah.
because look, the whole position basically is about being a constant in terms of not letting somebody get to the quarterback, right? One mistake and there goes Justin Herbert's season potentially. And so it translates really well, and he navigated all those different things. And you brought up the Ohio State game. This is a point I was going to bring up too. Thinking back 2 years ago, people, will struggle to remember that far back in college football, but the Big Ten was much better 2 years ago than it was last year, really, especially in pass rush situations.
Yeah.
And so, everybody is talking about the Chase Young game with him, which he did a great job. The reps are there. You can see them. The game was 52-3. It was over halfway through the second quarter. I was there. And so, although that game was impressive, I think there were a bunch of other games. He faced 4 or 5 defensive ends that ended up getting, drafted in the NFL over these last couple of years. But at left tackle that season, there was a guy, AJ Espinenza out of Iowa. There was a Michigan State guy. There was a Michigan guy. There, against Auburn in the bowl game that year, he faced Marlon Davidson. And so there was just a plethora of NFL caliber defensive ends that he faced in college and performed very well against. I don't think he allowed a single sack that year at left tackle. So no sacks allowed against 5 or 6 different guys. And that's not even throwing all the defensive tackles from the 2019 class in the Big Ten that ended up going pro. So a much deeper pass rush class than just that game against Chase Young. Yeah. But also he did shut down Chase Young. And now that everybody sees how much Chase Young is dominating the NFL, it's like, maybe we should pay attention to that guy.
Yeah, and if the NCAA weren't stupid, Chase Young probably would have won the Heisman that year. Well, that's too much to say because Joe Burrow. But anyway, I digress. So, you mentioned the potentially switching into guard or maybe switching to right tackle. Let's talk about him as a left tackle only. What are the Chargers getting in him as a left tackle? And do you think that, you kind of already said this, but, is he someone that can play left tackle in your mind for the next 10 years for the Chargers?
I think so. And I think that because although, there were certainly concerns about his arm length, right? That's why everybody is saying he may have to move inside the guard because most left tackles have the arm length, to keep distance between them and the ends that are rushing them. But Slater is an elite athlete. He really is. He is fluid for his size. He's got tremendous footwork in both the run and the pass game. He tested very well, obviously, but you see it when he plays. For how big he is, he moves very well. And so that's what really stands out when you watch him. And I think that's why ultimately he can make up for that and be a left tackle in the NFL. The comparison I've seen out there that I like a lot is to Joe Staley, where Joe Staley had some similar concerns about his arm length, but he had the requisite size. He played with a certain amount of power and athleticism that he could get away with the slightly shorter arms. And I think that's the case for Slater too. And, like we just talked about, the production was off the charts in college. So not only is he this elite athlete, but you combine both traits and production. And that's ultimately what makes a great NFL prospect, right? He allowed 0, sacks in his last season on 355 pass blocking attempts. And as I said, against elite competition as far as you can get in college. And then before that, he was the highest graded freshman offensive lineman. His second year was very solid as well. I think he allowed 2 sacks his second year, graded out extremely well on Pro Football Focus then too. So you're combining a guy that seems to have the whole package. And that's why I was so surprised he was available. And as I said, even if he's not a left tackle, he clearly has the athletic traits that he could play right tackle or potentially guard as well.
Yeah, definitely agree there. I don't know if you remember this one block against Ohio State, talking about the Chase Young game, but there's this one block where he goes from the left tackle and essentially all the way to the right hash to block Malik Harrison, the linebacker. And it's just like, sometimes sometimes the athletic traits pop and sometimes they don't. And when you watch Rashawn Slater, it's like, this guy pops. Like, I'm so excited to get him on the team. And it's just, I can't wait to, be able to watch him in the NFL.
For sure. And when it comes to Northwestern football, typically there aren't a lot of athletes on the field. But because of that, he stood out. Of course, this is simplifying things, but what makes a great offensive lineman? Somebody that big should not be able to move that fast. And when you watch Northwestern play, you're like, who is that guy who's running down the field with Justin Jackson and blocking, 10, 15 yards? And it just stands out so much that I'm not surprised that he ended up this high. It's just funny to me that he was a star at Northwestern even after his freshman season, because we're like, wow, this guy's awesome. And then slowly but surely, everybody else kind of caught on to that. This guy, hey, he could be an NFL player.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about the pro day from Northwestern this year, you see this 310-pound offensive lineman go and run his 40-yard dash, and then you watch one of his 240-pound linebacker teammates run a slower time than him, which was just kind of hilarious to me. But Henry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, he is an incredible athlete, and you see it. Him being the son of a former NBA player, you see it in his feet. I mean, he just
100%.
moves for his size. That it's just so much more fluid than at least I've been accustomed to seeing Northwestern offensive linemen move. It really it stood out so much.
Absolutely agree there. So Henry, this has been great, man. I cannot thank you enough for joining us and talking about Rashawn Slater and the Browns. We wish the Browns well. As I said, Chargers fans, you can follow Henry at Henry_Ettinger and and he's the host of the Rebuild podcast on Blue Wire. Thanks again, Henry.
Thanks for having me on, Steven.